I know this video is going to be a little late considering it's already February, but I still want to take some time to share some of the great books that I read this year. I decided to pick up reading again while I was down in Tampa attending college, because all of my classes were online, everything I did was online, and I was sick and tired of staring at a screen. I needed an activity that pulled me away from the screen. And that's when I remembered that books exist. Throughout my educational experience, English has always been my least favorite subject. I hated it so much that I thought I'd never pick up a book again. My teachers were great, it's just the subject is really just awful. And yet, I ended up reading 16 books this year. I think I still hate English, but reading is fun, especially when you get to choose what book you read, and you're not forced to do 3 annotations at a minimum per chapter. So, now that the year's over, I'm going to be doing a quick review of every book that I read this year. And I'm also going to be putting them on a tier list so it's slightly more entertaining for you guys. To start, we have Farther Than Any Man by Martin Dugard. This book was about Captain James Cook, the man who discovered Australia and New Zealand. It's actually a pretty fun read, especially for a non-fiction book, which I really wasn't expecting. The book is about Cook's life, though it mostly focuses on his 3 voyages. The author has this theme throughout the book of the Pacific being James's personal kingdom, and I really liked that aspect of the book. I ranked this book 4 stars on my Goodreads, but in comparison to the other books I read this year, we're going to put this at B tier. Next up, we have a literary classic, Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. This is a fantastic book, though it was written in 1872, so it does remain dated in some places. This book surrounds the story of Phileas Fogg, who makes a bet with some British people that he can go around the world in 80 days. It's a fun little story, and the pacing was done really well. I'm going to put this in A tier. I highly recommend this if you're looking for a really short read. My copy of the book was only 130 pages. My third book of the year was Warwolf by Herman Luns. It tells the story of the Wolf family, which is a family that resides in a village in Germany during the 30 Years' War. Throughout the war, the village is constantly plundered by other nations like Sweden or Austria. And after this happens for a while, the villagers finally decide that they're just going to kill every soldier that enters the town. It's a really cool story idea, but unfortunately, all the battles that take place are kind of just described through dialogue, and you don't actually get to read about those events taking place. Regardless, it was still fun to read about the everyday lives of these German folk. So I wouldn't call this book boring. It's simply underwhelming. Therefore, this book will be going into my C tier. Now, this next book is one of my favorite books of the year. I've recommended it to so many of my friends and family, and those who have read it have thoroughly enjoyed it. That book is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I've actually recommended this book to so many people that my sister has constantly joked that I'm building a cult. She also got me this mouse pad of the cover for Christmas, and it's a nice mouse pad. It's nice and pretty. I like it. If I'm being completely honest, I do not know how to describe this book, but I'll try my best. It's about a world where a hurricane crosses over a continent every few days, and on this continent is a kingdom in which the king of the kingdom was assassinated. You read from the perspective of a slave, a noblewoman, and a general. There's also magical swords that slice through people's souls, I think. I'm not too sure, but they're cool. Everything about this book is phenomenal, from the story, the characters, the setting. It's just great. I cannot recommend this book enough, though do be warned that it's around 1,200 pages long. But every single one of those pages is worth the read. This is going in S tier. Book 5 of the year was Mort by Terry Pratchett. This book is about a kid that gets an internship with death, like the personification of death, like the Grim Reaper, and then he messes a bunch of things up. The story was really confusing, and I found the sentences very hard to read. Also, this author is known for absurd humor, and unfortunately, most of that humor fell flat with me. That's about it for this one. I'm just gonna put it in D tier. I've read this next book before, but decided to read it again, and that book is Animal Farm by George Orwell. It's a book about some animals that decide to take over a farm and run it themselves. It's a fantastic book on authoritarianism and the hypocrisy of politicians. It's also a very short read. I'm gonna put this in A tier, but below Around the World in 80 Days. Next up is Carnivores of Light and Darkness by Alan Dean Foster. This book is about an African man, though he's a fantasy African man, and he's in a tribe, and a white man washes on shore of his tribe, and the guy says that he was saving a woman, and then he dies, and then the tribesman is like, a dying man's words are sacred, and we need to fulfill them, so he goes on this quest to save a woman that he's never heard of. And that's the story. This is an awful book. The main character, the African guy, he has a bunch of magical powers that never get explained. Ever. He just pulls them out of nowhere and solves these problems. There's also no climax to the book. The woman he's trying to save just doesn't ever show up in the book. I should note that this is the first book in a trilogy, but I don't think that means that you can't have a climax. I think every book should at least have its own individual climax, and this book's really boring because the plot never does anything. There's no climax. I'm planning on reading the rest of this trilogy this year, though that's only because I'm frustrated with the book so much that I have to read the other things to understand what's going on and if there's actually a climax to the series, because clearly in this book there isn't one, and this is going in D tier. This is by far the worst book I read this year. After reading that, I decided to give Terry Pratchett another try, and that led me to Small Gods. Small Gods is about a very powerful god that gets trapped in the body of a turtle, and the turtle has to work with one of his religion's followers to return back to his godly status. This book was a lot funnier than Mort, and it also covers the topic of religion extremely well. I really recommend this book. It balances its seriousness and its humor pretty much perfectly. I'm gonna put this in A tier. Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson is the sequel to The Way of Kings. The Way of Kings focused more on the character Kaladin, which was the slave guy, while this book focuses more on Shallan, the noblewoman. Shallan was actually my least favorite character in The Way of Kings, but in this book she's actually a pretty fun read. I don't want to spoil any of the plot, because if I say too much then it spoils The Way of Kings, but this book is in S tier. I actually think it's a bit better than The Way of Kings just because of how the book ends. I think that was done really well. The next book I read was from the same series. It's called Edgedancer, and it's labeled as book 2.5 because it's sort of an in-between books between the 1,200 page behemoths that this series is. I didn't really like the character in this book. Lift is her name, and I don't think she's that awesome, though the story is fairly decent. I'm gonna put this in C tier, right above Warwolf. Another C tier book this year was The Great Gatsby. If I'm being completely honest, having to read this book in school was the reason I started hating reading. Before I started this book, I kinda had the idea that I'd be making this video, and I decided I wanted to read a book that was so bad that I could put it in its own tier. The first book that came to my mind was The Great Gatsby. Unfortunately, this book is actually pretty decent, especially when you're not forced to look into every single small detail. If you're somehow not familiar with this book revolves around some rich people and love affairs in 1920s New York City. There's also a movie out with Tobey Maguire and Leonardo DiCaprio, but I actually got upset at parts of the movie because it wasn't true to the book. With all that being said, I'm going to put this book into C tier. It's still not that enjoyable. Next up, I decided instead of reading more of the Stormlight Archive, which is the series I've been talking about from the author Brandon Sanderson, I'd try out one of his standalone novels. So I read Warbreaker. This is a fantastic book and is by far my favorite book of the year. It's about a princess that is married off to a creature known as the God King in order to prevent an invasion of their own kingdom. The story also follows one of the god aristocrats named Brightsong, a guy that can make towels dance, and another princess. Everything about this book is phenomenal. Brightsong is my second most favorite character in all of fiction, including movies, TV shows, books. He's that great. We'll get to my favorites soon. The cast, the setting, the plot, it's all amazing. And if I haven't mentioned it already, Brandon Sanderson's writing style is just super easy to read. I don't know what he does differently compared to others, but it just flows off the page. Warbreaker is going to the top of my S tier list. After that, I read Oathbringer, which is the third book, or fourth book, depending on how you look at it, of that series I've been reading, the Stormlight Archive. The first book revolves around Kaladin, the slave guy. The second book was the noblewoman, Shallan. This third book follows the general, Dalinar. Dalinar is my favorite character in fiction. Everything revolving around him in this story is just great, and I loved reading it. I can't say too much more because I don't want to spoil 3 books, but just know that if you read up to this point, you're in for a treat. The climax is indescribably good, the story is magnificent, and I'm stressed out at not being able to share all of the good parts of this book. You cannot have my pain in regards to that feeling until you've read it. I didn't know what I was getting into when I first started reading this series, but I'm so glad that I did. By the way, if you like Harry Potter and think it's the best fantasy series in the world, I think this series is tiers above it. And I think Harry Potter is a very good fantasy series. Oathbringers, obviously going up into S tier. I'm gonna put it right below Warbreaker, but just know that they're pretty much equal in my mind. This next book actually goes against part of my intro for this video, as it's a book that I was forced to read for a class. Luckily, at this point, I had read so many books and I'd gotten into the routine of reading that when I read this book, it was really quick and a lot easier than it would have been like a year ago. All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Remarque is a difficult one for me to rank. It does a phenomenal job at retelling the life of a German soldier during World War I. However, the ending to the book, I don't necessarily like it, but it's also accurate for its time. So I didn't like it, but the thing I didn't like about it was something that happened in real life, which makes the book more accurate. So I don't know if I should rank the book higher because of it, or rank it lower because I didn't like it. I will be ranking this in C tier, right above Gatsby, of course. But regardless of that opinion, if you're looking for a World War I book, I cannot recommend this enough. It is a great World War I book. Next up is book 3.5 of the Stormlight Archive, and that is Dawnshard. I liked the character Risen in this book, and the story was actually pretty great, as is usual with Mr. Sanderson. However, it's a pretty forgettable book. It's still a generally good book, but I'm gonna put it in B tier. Book number 16 of the year is the final book that I read. And this is another one I had to read for class, and that is Under a Cruel Star by Hedda Kovali. This is the memoir of a Jewish girl living in Czechoslovakia from 1941 to 1968, which spans World War II through the Cold War, and it ends right at the Prague Spring of 1968. It's actually a really nice read on life during this time, and I'm glad I had to read this. If you're looking for a book about Eastern European life during the Cold War, this is a great book for that. I'm gonna put this at the top of B tier. It was actually pretty good. So that'll wrap up my 2021 book tier list. I hope I described a book that you might be interested in. If I haven't described a book that you're interested in, that's fine too.
Read The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson.
but if there's one takeaway I think you should have from this video, it's that you should give reading another try. It's likely a lot better than you remember it to be. I know this is the first video since my revamp video, but this isn't the type of content I'm gonna start producing. I only have one more video like this planned, and that'll be the video after the next video. So after that, we'll be getting into more typical content of mine, just with higher quality. Anyway, thanks for watching.